Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar today. I'm Sue Rogan, the Director of Strategic Partnerships with the Cash Campaign of Maryland. In case you don't know us, CASH stands for Creating Asset Savings and Hope. We are a statewide nonprofit that works to promote the economic advancement of low to moderate income individuals and families in Baltimore and across Maryland. We're delighted to be a sponsor for this webinar today, as well as being a member of the Public Awareness and Community Outreach Subcommittee of the Maryland Cybersecurity Council, which is the other sponsor for the webinar today. The council was created by legislation in 2015 and is led by the Maryland Attorney General Anthony Brown to work with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and other federal agencies, private sector businesses, and private cybersecurity experts to improve cybersecurity in Maryland. Some technical details during our time together today. We'd like you to please remain on mute, but please do put comments and questions into the chat because we do want to hear from you. This is being recorded and will be posted on the MD Cash Academy website as well as the Cybersecurity Council's website afterwards. During our time together today, you're going to learn about new legislation enacted to protect Marylanders. The ability for consumers to regulate how businesses collect, store, and use their personal data is a right that all Marylanders should have. Consumer data is not only an issue of privacy, but also an issue of security. Data breaches are disturbingly common incidents that impact consumers across Maryland. In 2023, Maryland had over 500 instances of data breaches. Those were the ones that were reported. This data collection also includes targeted advertising to children on social media platforms that have been linked to behavioral and other harms. With the lack of federal legislation, states are moving to protect their residents. Maryland became the 15th state to enact a consumer privacy law. That law, called the Maryland's Online Data Privacy Act, has been called the strongest comprehensive privacy law among the states and a game changer. Really delighted today to have two experts in the field with us who are going to be discussing this legislation. Senator Sarah Love was a House sponsor of the legislation, and she is the Maryland State Senator for District 16, which encompasses Bethesda, Chevy Chase, and Potomac. She was first elected to the Maryland House of Delegates in 2018. She served on the Environment and Transportation Committee and two of its subcommittees, Motor Vehicles and Transportation, which she chaired, and the Environment. She chaired Montgomery County House Delegation Land Use, Transportation, and Public Safety Committee. Sarah has also served on the Chesapeake Bay Commission, the Joint Committee on the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay Critical Area, and the Zero Emission and Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council. Sarah's legislative work has focused on the environment, PFAS, otherwise known as forever chemicals, privacy, protecting cyclists, animals, in addition to legislation protecting minors from sexual predators. Prior to her election to the Maryland House, Sarah was the public policy director for the ACLU of Maryland, where she led their policy and legislative work. During that time, she worked on many issues, including reproductive rights, racial justice, public funding for public schools, policing reform, criminal justice reform, senior drug policies, technology and privacy, the First Amendment, open government, and voting rights. Before working for the ACLU, Sarah served as a general counsel and legal director of NARAL Pro-Choice America, where she worked on federal reproductive rights policy and led a staff to support affiliates across the country working on state policy. She also spent several years out of the workforce raising her two children. Sarah graduated from Princeton University and Northwestern University School of Law. We're also very excited to have Marcus Roschecker with us. Marcus holds a law degree as well as a highly esteemed certification, Certified Information Privacy Professional in the United States. He is the Cybersecurity Program Director at the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security and lecturer in law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. In his role, Marcus focuses on legal and policy issues in cybersecurity and data privacy. He works with government agencies and the private sector to increase their understanding of the many legal and policy issues they face in cybersecurity and data privacy. Through the center, Marcus also supports with planning, training, and exercises to enable them to better prepare for and respond to cyber incidents. Marcus also serves on the Maryland Cybersecurity Council. He is a former chair of the council's Critical Infrastructure Subcommittee, which addresses critical infrastructure cybersecurity in Maryland, and he is part of the council's legislative committee, which makes recommendations on state legislation related to cybersecurity and data privacy. Marcus has developed and teaches 4 courses at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law: the law and policy of cybersecurity, cyber crimes, international law and cybersecurity, and information privacy. These courses are part of the Maryland Carey Law School's Cybersecurity and Crisis Management Law Certificate Program. Welcome to both of you, and Marcus, I will turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Sue. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome, Senator Love. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to quickly say thanks to the Cash Campaign as well for hosting this webinar. Really appreciate this. And to all the attendees out there, just want to encourage you to make sure that you check out the Cash Campaign's website because there's just so many other great webinars on there and other great resources that really are very helpful. So just a quick plug for the Cash Campaign. Senator, I want to welcome you. Like I said, thank you so much for being here today with us on such an important topic. We're going to get into all aspects of this new and important piece of legislation that you sponsored. But before that, I also want to remind the panelists or the attendees to our webinar that this is supposed to be somewhat interactive in that you all do have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So if you do have questions for the senator about the legislation that we'll be discussing, please post those in the chat and then we'll try to get to them. But in any case, let's get started. Senator, again, thank you for being here, taking the time to talk about the Maryland Online Data Privacy Act that, like I said, you sponsored. And as has been mentioned by Sue, you know, this is a game changer, this piece of legislation. And we also know that by now, you know, over a dozen states have passed similar pieces of legislation known as comprehensive data privacy protection legislation. But Maryland really is a standout in that I believe the law that we have here now is really, if not, is definitely among the strongest of these laws, and maybe even the strongest of these laws in terms of providing data privacy protections for Marylanders. So I want to get into all that and why that is, but you know, to get us started, maybe Senator, you could just give us kind of a high-level overview of what this law is, why it's so important, and then we can get into the details of it all.
Sure. Well, I want to start off just saying thank you to you, Marcus, for not only being here today, but also for all the work that you do. And thank you to Sue and to the Cash Campaign and to the Maryland Cybersecurity Council. I'm excited to be here. This was, I'll call it a labor of love. This is something that I worked on for many, many years. As Sue was reciting my resume, you noticed in there technology and privacy from my time at the ACLU. The issue of privacy is something that is very important to me. And it was really great to work on this bill, and it really evolved over time. So just sort of top level, this is a piece of legislation that applies to businesses that do business in Maryland, that either, and I want to get this correct, that in the past year has either controlled or processed the personal data of at least 35,000 consumers, excluding those that were done for, you know, completion of payment transactions. So those one-time payment transactions, those don't count. So either controlled or processed the personal data of 35,000 consumers in the last year, or controlled or processed the personal data of at least 10,000 consumers and derived more than 20% of its gross revenue from the sale of personal data. And just a quick footnote, the sale of personal data is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And if one of the things that was driving me is that people should have the control over their data. If they don't have a problem with their data being sold, then they can agree to that, and that's fine. But companies should not be able to profit off the sale of my data when I don't even know about it. So informing consumers and letting them make the choice over what happens to their data is a key part of this. So like I said, it applies to those companies off the bat, and then there are a number of exceptions for entities that it doesn't apply to, and then certain data that it doesn't apply to. But the short answer is that it gives consumers, like I said, knowledge of what's happening with their data. It gives them the right to know what data is collected, the right to delete it, the right to correct it, the right to opt out of targeted advertising, the sale of their data, or the use of that data for profiling, for all sorts of it's all listed out in the legislation, but it's called for legal purposes, and things that will make a difference, like for a mortgage or something along those lines. And then it has probably the nation's strongest data minimization piece, and this is what we really fought hard for, and that the tech industry really fought against. And what that says is that companies can only collect the data that is relevant to the service that they're giving you. And the way I described it to members was, if I'm playing solitaire on my phone, then the company that created that app shouldn't be tracking my location. It should only be getting the data that is relevant to my playing that solitaire game. So the way it's drafted is that the data has to be relevant to, for personal data, the data that's relevant to providing that service, and for sensitive data, which is data related to somebody, a child, or certain health information, race and gender information, location, that sort of information, then it has to be strictly necessary to provide that app.
Well, thank you for that broad overview. And I know we're going to get into a lot of the more specifics on a lot of the things that you mentioned, because there's some really key points here that you've already raised. But I think, again, at a high level, I want to talk a little bit about what is personal data, what is actually covered, what can the average Maryland consumer, what should they know about what kind of data about them is now protected or have greater protection. All of this, another point you already raised is, and why I think this legislation is so important, is that the majority of people, I don't think, understand or realize the scope and the magnitude of data collection that is happening about them as individuals, and how all that data is being used unknowingly. And consumers really have very little, or have had very little control or insight into that aspect of data collection and monetization of data about them. So I think it's important to just create more transparency, which I think this law does. And for the average consumer, they'll have more insight into what is being collected about them, how that's being used, and then for them to have the choice, right, to decide whether or not they're okay with that or not, if they want to put some limitations on that. So that's wonderful, and I think really important. But we got to know, what are we talking about? What kind of data are we talking about? What is personal data? I was wondering if you could share a little bit of insight on that, maybe give us a few examples.
Sure. So the law defines personal data as any information that is linked or can be reasonably linked to an identified or identifiable consumer. So that could be your name, your address, your social security number, your credit card, your location, any of those things, what car you own, any data you can think about that could be used to identify you, that is covered under personal data. So, somebody with the initials SL who went to this high school and graduated in this year, all of that data together can be personal data because it can be linked to me.
Right. Anything really that can identify you as an individual would be included under the law's definition of what personal data is.
Exactly.
So a really important point to make, because that, we need these kinds of definitions, I think, these broader definitions of what personal data is, because all this kind of data can be used in ways that we might not even anticipate, and can be used in a way to identify us as individuals. So thank you for clearing that up for us. I want to, and again, you alluded to this, but it's taken us a while to get here, right? To have this law actually, or this legislation actually become law. I know that, you know, within the Maryland Cybersecurity Council, we've helped advise over the years on what legislation like this should look like, and I know that, you know, you've worked on this for many years. So could you tell us a little bit about how we got here now this year? Why you know, we've had bills on data privacy protection introduced in past legislative sessions. They hadn't become law in those during those sessions. Now we are here in 2024, and it finally happened. What changed, and how do we get here? Why did we all of a sudden end up getting this law after so many years?
So I think a couple of things. One is, for something this complex, it takes several years because we as legislators are generalists. So while I may know a lot about a particular subject because I am the sponsor of that bill, other legislators don't. So it takes some time to educate them on it. So we've had several years of legislators getting a handle on what this bill is and what it would do. And for many years, the tech industry has been putting a lot of money into lobbying against these bills. And you actually, there are quite a few articles out there about this. And so legislators were hesitant because they don't want to stifle business, and they want to make sure that, you know, businesses can come to Maryland and can thrive. So they wanted to make sure they were balancing that, those two interests. I think one of the things that changed this year is that I would actually say the tech industry overplayed its hand, and went far enough to make it sound like the sky was going to fall if we didn't, if we passed this law. And that made legislators question a little bit. I think the other thing that happened is there were a lot of really committed legislators who understood several different aspects about this bill, how it helps to protect kids, and also the personal stories that helped them understand what we were trying to do. And so with them advocating for it, that really turned the tide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of tide, I think we're seeing a kind of a wave spill across the country, right? We see every year we see more and more states pass comprehensive data protection laws. We're still waiting on Congress, of course, to see if they might pass a national law as well. But in the meantime, states are kind of taking this issue into their own hands, and we see different versions of these laws. And but now we are here in Maryland. We have our version of it, and as has been mentioned, you know, it seems to be one of the stronger pieces of legislation, state legislation, that we see in the country. So, you know, as a Marylander, I think that's great to see. I want to ask a little bit more about the rights that Marylanders now have because of this law, the rights they have vis-a-vis their own data. You kind of gave us a list already, but I wonder if we could revisit that list of rights, and just to, you know, clarify them and to maybe highlight the ones that you think are most important.
Sure. So one of the things that is pretty standard across all of these laws is that consumers have the right to confirm if their data is being processed. They can access their data, they can correct inaccuracies, they can ask to have their data deleted, and they can obtain a copy of their data from the controller. Now, that's not to say all of this will be done, but they have the right to request for it to be done. And if it isn't done, they have the right to appeal. They also have the right to opt out of the processing of their data for purposes of targeted advertising. So that's kind of at the core of what we're talking about, is this targeted advertising. Because the more data that companies collect about you, the more they can push out targeted ads to you. So you looked for this pair of shoes, now they're going to give you an ad for all of these types of shoes that you might be interested in. So you have the option of opting out of that. You have the option of opting out of the sale of your personal data. And then the last one, it's called profiling in furtherance of solely automated decisions that produce legal or similar effects. So basically what that is an algorithm that takes all of this data and then decides how much, you should pay for your mortgage, or some other legal ramification that would have an effect on you. So those are sort of the top level rights that you have.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, and I think really highlights why this law is so important, right? These are important rights to have as a consumer, because as we were saying, I think we all need more transparency and more control over the data that's being collected about us and how it's being used, especially if it's being used to make decisions about what kind of services we may or may not get, right?
Right. Can I I want to give listeners sort of a real example. So when you go on a website and it says, manage your cookie preference, for a lot of them, if you click on that, you can, it says always necessary, and you can't opt out of those. But the other ones you can opt out of. You can opt out of the targeted advertising. You can opt out of the sale. You can opt out of the profiling. Then there's the other set that come from some of these other laws, where it's just a really long disclaimer. And it says, we sell your data. We are going to, give it to partners, sell it to partners for targeted advertising. And you don't have the option to opt out. You are just told what they do, and that's their privacy policy. And that's the distinction that I think is really important, that we have the one where you can make that choice.
Right. It's kind of a take it or leave it policy, right? If you want to use our service, we're going to collect your data, and if you don't feel comfortable with that, then you just can't use our service, and that's not really much of a choice. Yeah. All right, so we've covered kind of what the rights are now for Marylanders once this law goes into effect. And we talked a little bit already about what companies have to do, but maybe we can delve into that a little bit more. And I think, the big key here is, as you already kind of mentioned, is the data minimization piece. And I think that's really the big differentiator between the Maryland law versus all the other state laws. Can we talk a little bit more about that? And let's explain that a little bit more to our listeners. What does data minimization really mean, and why is it so important?
Sure. So data minimization is, as I said, it's saying to the company, you can only collect the information that is reasonably relevant to providing the goods or service. So again, going back to my solitaire example, they don't need to know what my location is to provide me solitaire. They don't need to know, what city I'm in, what address I'm at, whether, I'm at home or not at home. They just need to provide me the game. So that's what it's saying. And what, and it gives a little bit of wiggle room in there. It says reasonably relevant. So it gives the company a little bit more latitude. But if we're talking about sensitive information, so they are taking, say, health information that isn't otherwise protected by HIPAA, or they are taking my location information like Waze, if I'm trying to get somewhere. So Waze does need my location information. Then the standard's a little bit stricter. It says it has to be strictly necessary to provide that service. And the reason these two things are important goes back to what Sue mentioned at the very beginning. And that is, well, first of all, companies shouldn't be collecting our data without our knowledge and consent. They shouldn't be then selling it and profiting off it without our knowledge and consent. And beyond they just shouldn't be taking our data, is the data breaches that are becoming more and more prevalent and more concerning. So the more data companies collect about you, the more data is at risk for a breach. Now, every company is going to say we have security measures, we handle breaches, our data is secure. Well, I mean, you just look at what's out there and you realize that everything is at risk. So those are the two biggest reasons for me why the data minimization is so very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually have a question or a comment from one of our webinar attendees who, I'm sorry to say, has experienced or was a victim of a data breach. So a lot of their personal data has been impacted and is out there now. And so this is just another example of how these data breaches happen all the time on a daily basis. I mean, we hear about big data breaches, in the newspaper almost on a daily basis, but there are smaller data breaches that are happening that aren't being widely reported. And individuals are impacted every day. And like you said, even if a company, and I'm sure most companies do, want to protect their data to the greatest extent possible and are putting in a lot of resources towards protecting the data that they hold and doing all the right things, even the best intention company is at risk for being hit and having a data breach happen. I mean, we've seen, even the federal government be hit with data breaches, and some of the biggest companies in the world get hit with data breaches. So no one's immune. And so your point about data minimization is so critically important also for the security side of things, right? Because if you don't have a lot of data and you get breached, not a whole lot of data gets revealed. But if you have all this extra data that you don't really need to provide your service or your product, that data is going to be impacted too during a breach, and it'll be out there. And why take that risk, right? To have all that data and have it all be potentially at risk and exposed. So the data minimization is good for privacy, but it's also good for security, like you said. Yeah,
Absolutely.
In fact, this law actually places some requirements on companies as well to take reasonable, physical and other safeguards, administrative safeguards and technical safeguards to protect the data that they hold. So that's another piece to all of this as well, which is great.
Yep, exactly.
The law, another thing the law does is actually put additional protections on, or establish additional protections for minors. Those Marylanders who are not yet 18, which is also, I think, a very important piece of this legislation. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. How does the law provide extra protections to minors, and which, like I said, is I think another issue that gets discussed a lot around the country and within the states, but here in Maryland, we were able to, I think, do something pretty special in the legislation.
We actually were, and I'm really happy about this. So, couple of things. So definitions matter. And one of the key definitions that was the subject of a lot of discussions was with respect to a child. So in a lot of the other state laws, it is data that's with respect to a known child. And in my perspective, that gives companies a lot of wiggle room. They can say, well, I didn't know they were a child. So in our law, it says that the company knew or should have known the individual was a child, which puts a lot more responsibility on them and gives them a lot less ability to evade, not putting, too much bad intent, but for those who want to gather this data and sell it, they really can't get around the law. if they knew or should have known that that person was a child. So that's a really important definition to put forward up front. Then with respect to that data is considered sensitive data. Any data with respect to an individual that the company knew or should have known was a child, which means it cannot be sold ever. In a lot of other states, sensitive data can be sold with the consumer's consent. In ours, full stop, sensitive data cannot be sold. So that's a really important protection for minors. And then the other thing is that that a company cannot process the personal data of a consumer for the purposes of targeted advertising if they knew or should have known it was a child. So they can't take this data and process it in order to push out ads to children. And that's another key thing for kids.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about these two pretty strong protections for minors.
Absolutely. Yeah, they are very strong protections. And you know, those of us who are parents and have their kids online, you know, it's great to see that there's a bit more protection for that online usage of devices and the collection of data on minors. So it's very good to see that aspect of the law as well. So this, you know, this all sounds great, but I'm wondering how the law is going to be enforced. You know, what if you are a Marylander and you feel like you know, your rights with vis-a-vis this law have somehow been violated, that you know, some company is let's say selling your data without your consent or collecting your data without your consent. What would that Marylander do, or how is the law enforced generally?
So you hit on another deeply fought piece, and unfortunately, here's one where I lost. And that is, I wanted what's called a private right of action, which would mean that that individual whose data was sold without their consent or collected without their consent would have the right to sue. Because what we see in other states, notably Illinois, when they have this a similar law with respect to our biometrics, so our irises and our fingerprints and our hand scans, facial prints. If someone takes that without their consent in Illinois, an individual has a right to sue. And that has really made companies change their behavior. But you can imagine that was something that was of real concern to the companies. And that was one of those pieces of negotiation. And so in Maryland, it is enforced by the Attorney General's office. So if somebody believes that a company has violated this law, then they need to reach out to the Attorney General's office. And we have a fantastic Attorney General. I appreciate the office very much. The downside of having the Attorney General enforce it is they are less likely to go after a company for one individual and more likely to go after a company if they find that it has been violating the law on a broader scale, which isn't to say they won't help out an individual, but they're just more likely if it's a broader scale. But I absolutely encourage anyone and everyone who thinks that their rights under this law have been violated to reach out to the Attorney General's office. But with that said, the law doesn't take effect until October 2025. So they can't violate the law until then.
That was going to be my next question. When do we get these rights as Marylanders, and when does the law start getting enforced? Yeah.
Yep. It
But,
goes
yeah,
into effect then.
Like you said, it's a question of resources too, right? There's you know, the Attorney General's office might not be able to go after every single violation necessarily, especially when it's maybe just limited to one individual, although they could. I think beyond that though, we can also remind our viewers that, it's also worth going to the company first, right? If you feel like they're not respecting their obligations under the law, you as a consumer can go to the company directly and ask them to essentially correct the mistake, and then they have a certain length of time to respond to your request, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So,
And that's another really important point, Marcus. Thank you for bringing that up, because most companies are good actors and they want to make their consumers happy. So if they're hearing from consumers that they are doing something that is upsetting consumers, I would hope that they would want to rectify that behavior, especially knowing how powerful social media is. They don't want people going out on social media and slamming them for violating the law. So absolutely, people should reach out to the company and give them the opportunity to rectify their behavior.
right. Like you said, I think in most cases, the companies will. We had one more comment from the audience. I heard that our cars are now the new iPhones. They are tracking us now. I heard that that you have to download the car company app to turn the personal data tracking off. So is there anything you want to respond in terms of that comment? I think these new cars are basically computers on wheels, right? They are tracking us and our location.
Yep.
Partially because that might be a service to the owner of the car. You as the owner might want to know where that car is, where you left it when you parked it. So it might be a feature, but that information, of course, can also be used by the car company potentially to kind of track where you're driving and how far you're driving, et cetera, and learn more about your behavior, right? So is this the kind of data collections that's going to be impacted by this law?
So it absolutely will be impacted by this law. That type of data collection is exactly what we're talking about. And again, consumers should have the right and the ability to say, yes, I'm okay with this. No, I'm not okay with that. And I'm glad that person brought that up, because it's there have been a number of articles out there about how cars are and car companies are gathering our information and how it's being used. And it's very concerning. So I do encourage folks to go online and make the election that works for you with respect to your car and what data you're comfortable with it collecting or not collecting.
Absolutely. All right. So I think that about wraps up all the questions I had, and I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience at this time, but Senator, I do want to give you an opportunity to say anything else you'd like to say about the law, or how we got here, or anything else you'd want to share.
Well, actually, I will comment on the two notes that came in as we were just talking about cars. They're not telling folks this when purchasing vehicles. That's unfortunate. They should, absolutely. And the comment about insurance companies, unfortunately, that was something that was taken out of our piece of legislation, because I've read articles as well where the information that car companies are collecting is then sent to insurance companies, and then they're creating rates based on your driving behavior, even if you've never gotten into an accident. Maybe someday I can change that. But unfortunately, insurance companies were exempted from our law. So did want to comment on that. But Marcus, I think we've covered everything else with respect to the law. I'm just really appreciative of the team that got this done. This was a group effort, as it always is. Senator Dawn Guile from Anne Arundel County was my cross file. I was in the House then, I'm in the Senate now. Chair C.T. Wilson of the Economic Matters Committee, Chair Pam Beidel of the Finance Committee, all of them worked really, really hard in passing this really important piece of legislation. And I just hope that people avail themselves of the opportunities out there to make decisions about their data, and that other states will hopefully follow suit and pass similar laws.
Absolutely. Well, as a Maryland resident, I thank you and the others for your work on this legislation. I think you know, as a consumer, this will definitely help all of us get more insight and more choice into how our data is used. So that's all good news. Sue, I want to hand it back over to you to make any closing comments.
Thanks so much. And thank you both so much. I really echo all the appreciation for this invaluable legislation. It's incredible what it's going to do to help people here in Maryland. One quick comment I will make about the note in the Q&A about identity theft is for you to reach out to the Attorney General's office. They have an incredible identity theft, very effective unit that can help you remediate and do all the things that you need to do to get back on the other side of that. And then the other thing that maybe we could just think about collectively suggesting, and I'm drawing back on the days when I worked in consumer protection as an investigator, that maybe the Attorney General's office would draft a template letter or certainly a fact sheet on this law that they would put on their website. And then individuals that feel a company is violating the law could use that template to send it to the company and, you know, maybe again, see if the positive response comes from it. But the template may say something like, you know, if you don't take steps to resolve my dispute, I may need to reach out to the appropriate legal department, which would be the Attorney General's office. So maybe they could think of doing some sort of template letter that individuals could use, but that's for 2025. So we do have contacts with them. We will work out with them. So I want to thank everybody who attended this webinar, and I want to encourage everybody who's here today, who is viewing it later, to take this information and talk about it in your communities, both with the people that you're working with, your friends, your family. We need to get the word out about this so that people know that they need to be careful about their data. So many people that we're working with don't see the need, and we need to do that education for them. So thanks again. This will be posted on Cash Academy website along with the Cybersecurity Council. Thanks both Senator Love and Marcus. Really appreciate you being here, as well as everybody taking time out today to attend. Hope everybody has a good rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.